Welcome back to Beautifully Complex, everyone. I am so happy to have all of the caring adults in the world, not all of them, but many caring adults in the world here with us listening. I have Dr. Vanessa Lapointe with me, Dr. V, to talk about anxiety. And we're going to have a conversation about anxiety that is probably going to be different than other conversations about anxiety you've heard. And I'm really excited to unpack that. So, Dr. V, will you start by letting everybody know who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I am a mom, first and foremost, to two growing young men now who are almost 19 and 22 years of age. I practiced as a psychologist for more than 20 years before leaving that profession a few years ago to launch an international parenting support platform. And so I really have been, for about 25 years now, walking alongside kids and parents and families and just really seeking to champion them to live their best lives.
I love that. Tell us your perspective on anxiety and how it might be different from the more traditional model.
Yeah, so, it's interesting because there's a lot of talk about anxiety these days. I think that that's a reality for a lot of people. And with that, there becomes a lot of chatter about, what you're supposed to do if somebody's anxious. I was trained in a school of thought that I shall refer to as behaviorism and came into a school of thought that I shall refer to as developmentalism over the arc of my career, not just professionally, but also personally, when my youngest son was impacted by anxiety and I needed to kind of figure out, okay, like, what are we going to do and what feels aligned for me in this? Where I have landed is this idea that where we often begin with anxiety treatment is not where we should be beginning. We usually begin with, focusing on what's happening inside the child or inside the parent, that's this feeling of anxiety, and then we get busy with trying to eradicate that feeling. My understanding of anxiety is that we don't start there. In fact, we have to zoom the lens way out and really take some time to take stock of what's happening around the child and consider very deeply whether or not that environment is working for them. And in the vast majority of cases, I would suggest that the people who are feeling anxious these days should be feeling anxious because they are living a life in an environment that is entirely incongruent with what it is that they need as humans. And so, of course, they're anxious. We don't treat that by trying to anesthetize those thoughts. We treat that by sorting the environment so that it's much more aligned with what the person needs.
And we do push kids into environments. We have these systems like school, and we put them in the environment and we say, this is it. This is what you have to do. You're going to have to figure it out, right? So I can hear a lot of parents asking already, what do we do about the environments where we don't have as much influence over what's going on there?
It's a great question. And the reality of the messy middle that defines our existence, right? Where we're always trying to navigate these things that we can't necessarily control. And I think it comes to two things. One is to really get fierce in how you are approaching the adjustment of the environment. And so it's not, one conversation with a teacher. In my son's case, he had developed profound school-based anxiety. It was many, many conversations with the teacher, with the school counselor, with the school administrator, trying to sort of bring a cohesive team together in order to really understand what his needs were. And I ultimately made the, I suppose, radical decision to actually remove my son from that environment because it was so problematic for him. His older brother, no issues, was sailing through that. But my little guy was not coping. And so I actually had to get fierce enough that I shifted that environment. And I moved him into a school that was maybe more aligned with the kinds of emotional needs that he had and also the learning needs that he had. So I think the first thing is, we really do need to get kind of fierce about what it is that we are able to do. We often cut ourselves off at the knees and think, I don't have any power in this, when really
Yeah.
you do have power. So get big, get fierce, get radical about that environment piece and see what happens. The other
that.
thing that I have come to deeply understand that may be helpful is that there's something we can do as parents that activates this invisible string between ourselves and our children, so that when they are away from us, having to contend with these challenging kinds of situations, they feel really strongly that they have this connection back to us. And even though we're not there with them, the experience of the relationship provides them this invisible shield that travels with them into whatever environments they might be in.
Can you tell us what that looks like
Mm-hmm.
in real life, in practice? Can you give us an example?
Yeah. So I'll use an example of when my son was struggling, and I would send him off to school every day for 6 or 7 hours away from me, where he had to, cross his T's and dot his I's and mind his P's and Q's and sit crisscross applesauce and,
Yep.
and it was challenging for him. It turned out he had an undiagnosed learning disability and a clinical hearing loss, and all the while was getting reprimanded, for not paying attention and not doing a good enough job and not learning fast enough. And so what he needed, because I couldn't be there all day long, I was still, first off, I was still kind of cracking the code, figuring out what was working and not working. And secondly, the reality for our family was that I needed to be employed. So I was working outside the home during the day. But I figured out how to send myself to school with my son so that he would feel my presence. He was young at the time, so 6 going on 7. We visited his school playground on the weekends, and we left invisible stashes of kisses underneath the slide, at the point where you stand in line waiting to get on the monkey bars. So as he wandered around his school playground during the week, he knew the places that we had, created this magic little bubble where he could go and get a little bit of a mama top up. I also got
Amazing.
so sweet. I got very concrete with him. I get no downstream kickbacks from this company, but I've kept this all these years because I bought this little kamochi, it's called, and the mama heart went to school with my son, and there's a little hook, so we hooked it inside his backpack. You can see it's all dirty, and it was filled up with magic mama love. And so if he ever needed just a little top up because the day at school was getting hard, he would just stick his hand in his backpack and squeeze that. And he knew that I had the little kid part of it with me at work or with me on the road if it happens that I was traveling. So I did those things concretely, as well as, creating these stories around all of that. The other piece, though, was to really instill in my son the values of how this all flows. So first and foremost, the thing that matters more than anything else is what I think of you. And what I think of you is you are magic. I think the sun rises and sets on you. I think you are like, the essence of a star wrapped up inside a human. And so I don't care what Mrs. So-and-so has to say or what Mr. So-and-so has to say, because this is what the truth is. And so we will abide by that truth in how it is that we live our lives. And then make sure that I'm collecting all of his tears around his sorrow, that these other folks weren't showing up the same way. So there's something about that shield when you really get that your parent has been straight with you about the value that you carry as a human, not because you know how to read or not because you're really good at listening, but simply because you breathe, that you are valued and you are worthy, and I can shield you by instilling in you that ultimate belief that that's how I see things. And I will put my money where my mouth is. I will show up and I will make sure that I've got your back in the situations where we really need to be doing.
I wish I had heard some of those ideas when my kid was little. A little playground. Oh, man. I did when he was in elementary school also, and having a really hard time. I got these little smooth metal coins that you could get engraved, and he could take it in his like one said, "I'll see you soon," and "Mama loves you," and stuff like that. And he would take them in his pocket and he could rub on them and be reminded that like this part will end and you will be back with me again. They were easily lost, but but it helped. We had school
Sure.
avoidance and refusal from fourth grade to graduation, and it's so tough. And they do, I think, need the safety that we can provide in those environments when they're not with us. And those are such great ideas to do that. How do parents kind of decode or crack the code, as you called it, on what might actually be helpful? What do they need? What is it maybe in the environment that's not working for them? What do they need from us, from other people? Like, how do we get started down that path of figuring that out?
Yeah. It'll be different, of course, for every family, depending on the unique needs that are coming forth and the temperament and personality and everything of those involved. But I think, you could apply a little bit of a formula to it, a soul-based kind of formula. The first would be to get very relationship focused. That's essentially what we were just speaking about. Like, how do you be connected whilst apart? Because we know as a social species that experience of connection is life-sustaining. And so it will be, the opposite of anxiety, one could say, is connection. And so to really get focused on those relational pieces, to kind of get that sorted out. The other thing would be, I'd sometimes say that you have to be willing to kind of like just sniff around things for a while. And to be fair, I was a trained child psychologist. I have a specialization in how learning comes on board for kids and how reading skills develop and writing skills develop and math skills develop. And there was my own kid with dyslexia, and I hadn't seen it. Like, I didn't get it. There was my own kid. The first thing I say to every parent who ever comes to me worried about their child's learning: when was the last time you had their vision checked, and when was the last time you had their ears checked? So we can make sure that the systems are, I missed it. I missed it entirely. He couldn't hear. And so really be gracious with yourselves as parents whilst you're in the sniffing around stages, because it's tricky when you're embedded in the situation to always see it with the kind of clarity that an outside person might. And so spend some time with that. Really listen to your children. Don't think of them ever as being manipulative, as trying to kind of get out of things or whatever. Instead, look upon them as kids who are doing the very best that they can to be adaptive. That's the word, not manipulative. Adaptive to the situations and circumstances that they find themselves within. And when we can understand children through those kinds of eyes, then we're actually just much more open to hearing and seeing what might be actually up for them. So that you then know, go get your kid a learning assessment, or go get your kid fitted with a hearing aid. Then to take those things on because you've really sort of stayed open to it, and you haven't assumed through this, childism kind of view that the kid is trying to work it so they can get out of school, but you've really been open to hearing about what might be possibly up underneath it all. So be relationally focused and stay open while you do the sniff around, all the while being very gracious with yourselves, because it's a lot to figure out sometimes.
It's a lot to figure out, and we don't know. Nobody gives us a parenting manual in the first place, but definitely not one that says there might be some differences here, and this is how you figure it out, or these are the people you might look into helping you, or any of that. We get nothing.
Exactly.
And so it can be so hard to figure out what to do. And to even know that there's this whole range of things that maybe could be a possibility. I mean, so many parents don't even know about dyslexia or dysgraphia, or what anxiety sometimes looks like when it doesn't look anxious. And I'm so grateful that you said, don't view it as manipulation. This is something I hear in coaching all the time. I booked a call with you because my kid is so manipulative and blah, 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 right? And I'm like, okay, well, let's back out from that, because I'm pretty sure that's not really, it feels that way though. As a parent, like, it feels that way, but it's, I think, guided by this need for safety and protection, right? And that's where that's coming from. So I'm just so, so happy that you said it so concretely for everyone to hear. Can we talk a little bit then about, that's one way anxiety could show up, as manipulation. What are other ways that anxiety might show up? What might it look like on the outside when it doesn't look like anxiety?
So, and that's the tricky, shifty thing about anxiety, particularly in children, is that it doesn't often show up in ways that have you full of like heart swells for your child.
Yeah.
It often shows up in ways that you're like, oh wow. So I gave you life and this is what you give me back.
Mm-hmm.
They can be a little bit unlikable, to be frank, when
Yeah.
they're in the throes of anxiety. And so irritability is a big one for kids and for adults. But for kids, because they're still developing that internal capacity to manage big feelings and regulate around their own emotions, that irritability can be extra. And so you can watch for that. You can also see, like really heated refusal. So you mentioned school refusal a little bit earlier, and I think a lot of times people, think about that and they see their kid with puppy dog eyes pleading that I don't have to go to school. But a lot of times that isn't puppy dog eyes. It's rage and it's lashing out and it's big
Yeah.
tantrums and it's melting down. And it's your kid like really at you instead of at the situation or the environment around them. And so it can be like a very sort of labored experience, relationally speaking, to stay in your lane as a parent and not take any of what your kid is putting out there personally, because it's not personal, it's anxiety. And that's the only way they know how to manage it is for it to leak out in these crusty, kind of difficult, challenging ways. We also see a lot of sleep disturbances in anxiety. In fact, all of the anxiety diagnoses in the DSM, if we're going to heed the DSM, which might be another point of discussion, they all have buried in them this idea that sleep gets disrupted, either sleep onset or the continuation of sleep where it becomes interrupted sleep. And so, if you have a kid who's super difficult to rouse in the morning because they've had this disturbed sleep, they might not even know that it is disturbed sleep because it might be just so the norm for them. So you can be watching for sleep disturbances. When things have gotten very tricky, the younger the child, the more likely it is to go into the body. So you can see withholding of bowel movements, urinary overflow when they actually are toilet trained, and that would be unusual for them. So those kinds of body-based things, interesting things that pop up with food, where they will eat, only 6 things and nothing else because it's part of how they control their environment and control the world around them. So you can, it's a lot of these things that you might not classically see as anxiety, but that's how it kind of tends to present, particularly in the developing child.
Mm-hmm. I think we really always have to ask the question, when there's challenging behavior, could anxiety be fueling it? Because I think so often the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Especially lately, post-COVID for kids, I think there's so much more, as you were saying, like it is kind of normal to be anxious about what's going on in the world and how difficult things have been as of late. You mentioned the word control, and that connected me straight back to manipulation.
Uh-huh.
But I see often kids who have anxiety really trying to control either others around them or the situation or their participation or not, like the school avoidance. How else might that need for control show up? And do we honor that need? Do we give them some of that control? Is that a healthy thing to do, maybe?
That control can show up in so many interesting ways. It can show up in ritualistic kinds of behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking right now of a client years and years ago, they had a home invasion. And there was, a very ritualistic behavior that developed on the back end of that, of a 3-hour-long lock checking routine that needed to happen every single night, or this child could not find any space inside of her soul to actually rest and go to sleep.
Yeah.
So, it can come out in ritualistic behaviors. We can also see control showing up in, just curious little things like how the stuffies get lined up every night, or the kind of clothes. It can present in sensory ways. And so all of a sudden I can only wear really soft clothes. I can't wear anything that taxes my body in any kind of way. So I want to control that. controlling food. Turns out that eating is like we cannot make somebody eat ultimately, because even if they swallow it down, they can throw it back up. And so eating becomes this kind of final frontier in terms of a way that a child would invoke control on the environment around them. Kids who show up with what I often refer to as Hulk energy, where they are actually the boss of you, and you might not even realize that it's happened, but they're the ones kind of commanding and demanding, and they're large and they're in charge, and they're doing that in an effort to try and control everything around them. You do not want to just let that run its course. You do want to pick up the message that's coming forward in that. And one of the things that I think about, like if you ever say to your partner, babe, I don't feel very connected to you. You need to tell me that you love me more. And then your partner turns around and they're like, I love you. And you're like, okay, but you just said that because I told you. Like it doesn't land in your soul. It feels like conjured, kind of like, it's a forced kind of thing. And it's the same for kids. If they're like, listen, I'm freaking out over here, and they're trying to let you know, and they're yeah, okay, I'm going to take care of that. Okay. Well, it falls a little flat because they had to tell you. You didn't intuit it. And so it becomes this tricky thing of trying to be like, oh, that's what they're telling me, and then get a step ahead of it. Get a step ahead of it so that your child experiences you as the one who has moved in so capably to control that environment. That honors the hierarchical ordering of the parent-child relationship, and there is an ordering to that, right? Not in a yucky way, but in a really gorgeous, a really supportive, a really caring way that allows the child to be at rest during their emotional development so they can just redirect their energy towards growing and going, not having to control everything around them. We want to be the ones that do that for them. So in the case of the lock-checking routine, we sure didn't allow that child to carry on with the 3-hour-long lock-checking routine. But step one was actually not to get rid of the lock-checking routine. Step one was to put the parent in charge of the lock-checking routine so that the child was like, oh, okay, you get it. You understand me, and I can just rest into your care. And now you're back in the lead position. And so now the child is going to be orienting to you. And so when you start to then, eventually, not immediately, but eventually you start to curtail that lock-checking routine a little bit, they're already at rest. They're already leaning into your capable provision. So they'll be far less likely to be, panicked about the fact that you're adjusting the control and far more able to just take your lead and kind of come through things. And so we don't want to shut down the control, and it can show up in a lot of interesting ways.
Yeah, for sure. I have social anxiety, and it was a real struggle for me, like in my teen and young adult years. And I would go on trips, like these teen trips, and I wouldn't eat the whole time. I was like, I can't eat in front of people. They might judge me. I can't do. And that was my way of trying. And these were like friends. And yeah, I was deep in it, deep in the social anxiety, and nobody knew, right? Like we're talking about a long time ago, but that control can show up in so many really sort of wild ways that we wouldn't always recognize. So I appreciate the discussion around that. I think it'll be helpful for parents. Can we talk a little bit before we close about the parent role in the child or adolescent's anxiety? And I'm thinking, like, how much do we inadvertently add to it sometimes? How can we show up to be more helpful in anxious moments? That sort of thing.
I'm going to give all the parents in the land a free pass right about now, because I actually think it's people like me who have created, in a lot of instances, the anxiety that our children, and to be fair, a lot of grown-ups are dealing with these days. Because when we approach parenting through the lens of managing behavior and getting it under control and having our children, present all shiny and polished, we will end up squashing spirit. We will end up squashing that sort of essence of what makes us human, to get a child to essentially erase their developmental needs and supplant them with our need for them to show up a certain kind of way. And because we are a social species, when we are interrupting the relationship that we are naturally meant to have with our children by imposing those kinds of conditions on our children, that's going to make them anxious for the same reasons, that somebody who's excommunicated from whatever society they belong to would become anxious, because we are a social species. We are meant to exist in contact, in closeness, and in connection. And if we don't exist in those conditions, it's going to freak us out, because we're going to get dead. I mean, if you think
Yeah.
historically how we've always lived, you've got to have the tribe, and your vibe is your tribe, and they also keep you alive, right? If you don't have a
Yeah.
tribe, you're not going to do very well out there. And so I think really honoring that's a core piece that we show up with. It's the essence of who we are as humans. And so to really get connected back to the relationship as a way of understanding how we navigate. And the other thing that I would offer to parents in their relationship with children around this whole piece of anxiety is that think about it, like turn it around. So instead of we're diagnosing the child with anxiety, think in your mind that we're diagnosing the environment. So we're throwing away the diagnostic labels for children, not because they don't get to have them, but because we're gonna use that as a mechanism for understanding what our next move might be. And if we were to diagnose the environment instead, how would we shift things? What kind of new eyes would we bring to this scenario, and how much more at rest would that put our children?
I love that idea. We talk so much about what needs to shift in the environment, what needs to shift in communication and relationships and all these things for our neurodivergent kids. And that just sort of makes it a lot easier to kind of think about it that way. I'm going to diagnose the environment. What's wrong here? What's out of whack here for this kid? And that's what's really helpful. Yeah. Tell everybody where they can find you online and learn more from you. I think you have an anxiety course as well that you offer.
Yeah. So Dr. Vanessa Lapointe, Dr. Vanessa Lapointe with an E on the end.com is my website. And I do have an anxiety course where it's a multi-modular course that you go through and you get to sort of sink into some of the principles that you and I have spoken about today. I'm also very active on social media. And if you are trying to cultivate a feed that, tops you up rather than taps you out, I try to put out, video content and other kinds of things on a pretty regular basis, just so parents get that experience of being seen and heard, and maybe get an idea or two that might be helpful as far as how they see their children and the ways that they're stepping in around all of that. I also have a membership community where I do monthly Q&As, and you get a weekly video message from me, as well as the program that I have called the Parent Transformation Journey, which is where I work one-on-one with parents. And we do intakes twice a year for that program.
Amazing. Such good work. I appreciate you so much and sharing some of your time and your wisdom here. I know that the listeners are really going to take away something valuable from this conversation. It's going to help them and their kids, because it's about all of us, right? We all matter. So I will link everything up that you just described. All of Dr. V's website and social media will be linked in the show notes at parentingadhdandautism.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. I will see you next time. Take good care.